Becoming a military pilot is no easy task. It is a highly contested role, and you'll need to be at your best to highlight yourself as the best candidate for that job. A little bit about me before we get into this video, and also what makes me qualified to give this advice. I am currently a pilot in the Royal Air Force, just come into the end of my training, so that means I'll be able to give you some first-hand advice and mistakes that I've went through, which will hopefully help you feel more prepared or more willing to attempt to try and get this job. First of all, I'd like to apologise for the background that we have here. I know it's slightly boring, but I think if this channel was to become successful, I would then probably use a camera and I'd speak to you directly through that camera. But until that point, we'll just keep these boring graphics and hopefully you can still get the same value from what I tell you out of this video. So the way this is going to be structured is I'll firstly go through some of the mistakes that I made and a lot of the things that I learned through the process itself. I won't go into too much of the specifics of the selection process until the end, as that's quite UK specific, but everything else that I say will be relevant no matter what nation you're in. I'll then go into the main point of what to focus on how to make you the best candidate and how to stand out above the crowd when it comes to your selection process. And then finally, as I mentioned previously, I'll just go through the selection process and the training, which is UK specific, but I'll just bolt it onto the end. So anybody that's in the UK that wants to know that, just stay until the end and I'll run through it then. So first things first, I'll run through some of the mistakes that I made, and there's some quite big learning points that come out of this that I think will help anybody that's planning on going through this process. So I had quite an unusual journey getting to this position. It actually originally started when I was 15 years old, and the Royal Air Force was running a bursary kind of scholarship program for young pilots to apply for. So 15-year-old me at the time, who was very interested in becoming a military pilot, then put in my application and then started preparing for the selection process, which at the time started with an initial interview. And back then I got one of these DVDs that was basically a how to become series, and one of them was how to become a pilot. I picked up the DVD and I watched through it and I started to prepare, and the advice that was given on this DVD was basically memorize and learn everything that you need to know about aircraft, the squadrons that are in the RAF, the weapons the aircraft use, and basically everything surrounding the aircraft. So that's what I did. I went away and I practiced and learnt and memorized all the aircraft, what squadrons they're attached to, what weapons are attached to those aircraft, and what the non-attack aircraft do, so the surveillance aircraft and so on. And by the time it came around to my interview, I felt quite prepared and ready to take it on. Now, there were actually two mistakes that I made for this first part of my process. The first one's pretty obvious, and I was going to leave it out, but the recruitment office had actually moved from my local town to one of the nearby towns, so I had to get the train to go there. And quite obviously, you want to be on time for your first interview. I then took the train, and I had to stop to get another one into this town. So when I was swapping over trains, I spoke to one of the members of staff on the platform, and I asked them, does this train go to the town I need to go to? They replied yes, so I got on the train. What they didn't say is although it did go to that town, it wasn't going to stop there. So as I was arriving to the town, the train sped past and I had to frantically phone up the recruitment office and ask for another date for an interview, as I wasn't going to make it on time, which quite frankly isn't the best first impression you want to make. So that was actually my first mistake, and an obvious one not to do is to be late or not turn up for your first interview. So anyway, then I did book another interview and I turned up on time for that one. And the interview started well. You went through the basic questions of my background, and I'm sitting there fully prepared to wow them with all my aircraft and squadron knowledge. And then they start asking me questions about current affairs and why did the Iraq war start? Why did the Afghan war start? And although these are things I probably should have known, I hadn't prepared for this at all, and it took me by surprise, and I didn't have the answers that they wanted. And when the interview came to an end, they actually hadn't asked me about what weapons the aircraft or squadrons the aircraft were on once. So safe to say that interview didn't go too well. But the reason why, and I think this is why it's important that I've included this, is I went into the interview preparing to be interviewed to become a pilot. But actually, for a lot of these military roles, you're being interviewed to see if you qualify to be an officer. So what they actually want to see from you in these initial interviews is, are you suitable to be an officer at first? You know, how well are you versed with current affairs? What do you do in your spare time? And that sort of thing. So it was a huge mindset change for me that actually, yes, I'm going to be an officer first. I need to prove that I'd be suitable for that role before then they then look at me to be suitable for the role as a pilot. So I'm not saying don't prepare with learning the aircraft names and squadrons and so on. What I'm saying is don't let that be your sole focus for when you're preparing for these interviews, as it needs to be a broader aspect of the person that you are as opposed to a very specific role that you're looking for. So that for me was the end of the process when I was at that young age, and I continued with school for a few more years. I then wasn't particularly enjoying school too well. I stayed on for something that we call sixth form in the UK, which is a few extra years on top of your normal educational years, and decided to leave there early. I wanted to go get a job and I was kind of done with it. But I still had an aspiration to be in the Air Force, so I then joined the Air Force just in a different role. And then spent quite a few years in the Air Force, learning this role, learning what I could about the Air Force, and taking advantage of what the Air Force could give me. I also deployed to Afghanistan and a few other places, and also took the time to gain a master's degree. And then it was at this point that I was done with the role. I feel like I'd got everything out of it, and I was looking to leave the Air Force. So this brings me on to another point that I think a lot of people do feel, and I had built up the role of pilot in my head so much that it appeared to be this job that was unattainable. It wasn't even worth trying. But then I thought, do you know what? Let's just give it a go. Why would I not just try? All they can say is no. I'd spent the last few years kind of developing myself, learning, growing, and making myself a more rounded candidate. And as you can tell from what I said at the start, I was successful this time and managed to get the job. Now I want to share with you what made this possible for me, and I think what can help you if you want to try it yourself. So I've already alluded to a couple of these points that I want to bring up. The first one being, just go for it. The worst thing they can say is no. And if you never tried, you're always going to have that looming over the top of you that it's something that you could have been, or something that you don't believe that you could do, which is probably worse when you actually don't know. And the next one, which is something that you should be working on at all times, is making yourself as well-rounded as possible. And what I mean by that is, if you think of yourself as a member of a group of people, what would make you stand out from those other people? So for example, if everybody's in education, what do you do outside of education? What do you do within education that's different or shows that you've got more drive and more determination to get things done? So what I would suggest, depending on where you are in life, if you're working or in education, is look to take up sport in your spare time. Look at doing extracurricular activities outside of school or work, and get involved in adventure training, see if you can get involved in some sort of charities, any of those things, just something that makes you a bit different, gets you exposed to more things, gets you more experienced about things, because life experience is also very important when it comes to this process. But it's also super important that you're willing to show that even through your own determination, you're willing to improve and make things better. What they're looking for is future leaders in the Air Force or whatever branch of the military you're looking to go into. So if you can prove at this stage that you have enough self-determination to, for example, go get that extra degree outside of work time, or put yourself in a really uncomfortable position in adventure training on the weekends, or just something different to prove that you have the self-determination to improve yourself. So one way that I do that, even at this position, when I'm still in training, is, if you've managed to see some of the other videos from this channel, is I look at air crash investigations and I analyze and identify the issues, because not only does it help me learn more about these situations, it also helps me see how they could have happened, how people react, crew resource management, how things work in other parts of the world. It's all about learning and growing and developing to make yourself the best you can possibly be. So if that's something that interests you, just check out some of my other videos. That's a shameless plug, I know, I'm sorry. But moving on to the final bit of advice that I have. So we've covered, just going through it, make yourself as rounded as possible, always looking to develop and learn. And the main one for your interview stage, the aptitude, any sort of that, is prepare yourself. Make yourself as prepared as possible. So this is actually one of the things that got me the job, which wouldn't have if somebody hadn't helped me. So during the selection process, you have an initial interview, and then afterwards you have another final interview towards the end. And my initial interview went really well. And I asked the interviewer at the end, do you have any feedback for me that I can learn and develop from for my next one? And he was quite reluctant to give me anything. He was like, no, everything was fine. But I kept asking, and he went, do you know what? you could come across as maybe a little bit arrogant. So I took that as, okay, I'm definitely too arrogant. I need to rein that in. So I continued with the rest of my preparation, learning for aptitude tests and put myself in leadership and teamwork situations, problem solving, that sort of stuff. And then I had my final interview coming up. And it was just fortunate for me that at that time I had been helping out another family near me, and I didn't really know them very well. And the wife of the family was an officer already. And she basically just said to me, look, come and practice your interview technique with me, which was super kind. She'd taken some of her own time up for me to do that. And it was someone that I wasn't particularly familiar with. So I was then acting as if it was a proper interview. So I went and sat down with her. I did the interview. And at the end of the interview, she then said, look, you're not selling yourself enough. You're not saying all the things that you're good at and things that you're proud of, which then was a direct reflection of when I was told, don't be too arrogant. And I'd taken it too strongly to the point where I wouldn't have sold myself enough, and I would have definitely just undersold myself and not have got the job. So that to me was so eye-opening and so unbelievably important that if I could give any advice, or you listen to any advice through this, is if you come to an interview, I really recommend sitting down with somebody that perhaps you're not too familiar with and running through an interview with them, because the feedback that you get from that interview, I think will be so valuable that it would help you so much in your then proper interview with whichever service you're going for. One other thing that could assist you is that there's usually aptitude tests that come along with this role and the selection process. And there's a few apps out there that you can download that just get you used to some of the questions that are going to come up. It's not going to be identical, but it got you used to dealing with mental arithmetic and, quick reaction times of dealing with numbers, colours, sounds all at the same time. And it really helps just to sharpen your mind a little bit before you come to those aptitude tests. So then you're just a little bit sharper than what you would be without them. I'll put a link down in the description of the one that I used. I'm not saying it's the best one, it's just the one that I used, but you should definitely do your own research and find the best one that works for you. So before I move on to the UK specific stuff, I just want to say good luck on your journey. It's not going to be an easy process, but it definitely will be worthwhile in the long run. Even if you're not successful, you still would have learned a lot about yourself and be able to get a job that you find just as satisfying, hopefully. So for you guys in the UK, this is currently how the selection process works. So the first stage is the aptitude tests. And from what I can remember, I think it lasts about 9 hours in the day. So you come down to RAF Cranwell and you go through a series of tests for those hours. And it takes as long as, I think you have 13 hours in total, but it takes as long as it takes to get them done. But at the end of those 2 days of aptitude testing, you basically get categorized into what roles you can and can't apply for. So it will give you a score based on your aptitude tests. And if you get the score high enough within each role, then you're eligible to apply for those. And if you're successful at this point, you then move on to the first of your interviews. And this will be an initial interview at your local recruitment centre or AFCO. And as we said previously, they'll go through things such as your family life, education, your work experience, any sort of interests and hobbies that you have, and then your interest in the RAF of what you want to go for and why, basically. After this point, you'll then get invited again to go to RAF Cranwell to go to the Officer and Aircrew Selection Centre. And this is for a couple of days. And again, you get a final interview here. And this covers your achievements at school or college or in work. And then the second half of the interview explores your motivation for joining the RAF. So what you know about current affairs and the RAF's role in the national and international arena. And then also your knowledge about the RAF and the role you've applied for. So that's when all of the knowledge you've gained from learning about becoming a pilot will come out, and then you can give that in that interview. And then after that interview, and whilst you're still at the Officer and Aircrew Selection Centre, you'll then get split into smaller groups and get given a series of tasks where leaders will be selected, and it will just be watched by the recruitment staff, and your ability to work as a team, communication skills, motivation, leadership, self-confidence, and that sort of thing will all be assessed and then put into the whole picture of your selection process. Then after that, so you have a health screening, a medical, and a fitness test. And then if you're successful, then you'll be told that you're successful and you have a start date to go to initial officer training. So again, this is at RAF Cranwell, and you'll go there for about 24 weeks, and you'll learn everything there is about being an officer, what it's about to live in the military, and get all the basic skills that you need for basically becoming an officer in the Royal Air Force. Then after that stage, your flying training then begins, and you start with elementary flying training, which will either be on a tutor or a prefect aircraft. And again, this will just be your basic fly-in, and you'll be assessed through this process. And at the end of whichever one you've been on, you will then be streamed into one of the 3 aircraft types, which will either be fast jet, multi-engine, or rotary wing. If you get selected fast jet, most of your training will be down in RAF Valley in Wales, and it will last about 2 years. For multi-engine, you'll stay at RAF Cranwell, and you'll fly on the Phenom, and that will last about 10 months or so. And finally, rotary, you will then move across to RAF Shawbury, and that's about 18 months of training before you get to the end of that and awarded your pilot's wings. No matter what stream you go, you will then get role dispersed at the end of that training and be given the aircraft that you're going to go to, and go to their operational conversion unit, where you then learn and train to fly on that specific aircraft. And at that point, you will then join that squadron and fly that aircraft operationally. But that's all I really have for you at this time. If you have any questions, just ask me down in the comments below. A bit more of a relaxed video this one than usual. But thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one.